minute. I'm going to start by passing out a couple of sources that we're going to use to deliberate the case. So what we're passing out is going to be the indictment, or a portion of the indictment, a portion of the coroner's inquest. Look, you want to go ahead and have a seat? Portion of the coroner's inquest, and then the witness testimonies of 4 people. Now, there were originally 7 witness testimonies. Unfortunately, those have been lost very early on. Those would be testimonies of Benjamin Grove, Samuel W. Beck, and firstly, I don't remember the last man's name. However, we do still have the testimony of Josephus Goings, Roswell Hibbs, James Brady, and Joshua Van Velsen. So as we talk about each one of those, I will kind of give a brief biography of who these people are, how they're connected to the Goings family, and their connection to the case. So most of you have probably heard at least some form of the Melissa Goings story, and that is what you are here today. For those who aren't, I'll go ahead and tell the most common telling, which is that on April 14th, 1857, Melissa Goings got into a fight with her husband, Roswell. During that fight, the story goes is that he grabs her by the neck, she grabs a log of firewood, and she hits him over the head, killing him. At her trial, Lincoln was her defendant, her defending lawyer, and he asked to convene with her downstairs for a minute. Shortly after that, Lincoln reappeared, but Melissa did not. So the story goes, oftentimes, that Lincoln actually went ahead and opened a window and suggested that maybe the water was better in Tennessee, thus urging Melissa to go ahead and get out of the county, or the state, if she could. So the question we are looking at today is what really happened in that case, and according to the court records, was it really self-defense, and did Lincoln really enable Melissa to escape? So the first portion that we are going to start with is going to be the indictment. So now this is a shortened version. The actual test indictment is extremely long and very wordy, as you will find in this one section. In cases where it's kind of questionable what an actual document said, I did include a copy of that, so if you want to try and figure out for yourself what that says, you're more than welcome to. In it, I have translated as the top of his head. However, this could be lobe, is my other version that it might be. And it's going to be the first one on page 1. So it says, the said Melissa Goings, with a certain stick of wood, which she, the said Melissa Goings, in her right hand, then and there held the said Roswell Goings in and upon the top of the head of him, the said Roswell Goings, then and there unlawfully, feloniously, willfully, and of her malice aforethought, did strike and beat, giving to the said Roswell Goings, then and there, with the stick of wood aforesaid, in and upon the top of the head of him, the said Roswell Goings, one mortal wound of the breadth of 2 inches and the depth of 1 inch. So that kind of gives our first view of what that injury to Roswell actually looks like. There is actually a second version in the coroner's inquest. So unlike today, we're used to seeing on CSI, somebody dies, it goes to the autopsy, and the ME confirms an examination. That isn't exactly what happened here. So the coroner is Benjamin Kendig, and what he does is first of all get 2 people to exhume the body of Roswell Goings. Roswell had actually passed away on the 18th, 5 days after the inflicted wound, and then about on the 21st, they exhumed him there at his home, and they actually got a jury of 12 men to meet them there, along with all the witnesses, and that also included 2 doctors that had been there and did a post-mortem examination of him as well. So then the juries heard all witness testimonies, and that is where these witness testimonies come from. During the trial, we do not have any record of the witnesses, and it appears that Melissa disappeared right after it started, as soon as she pled not guilty. And so this is that juror's verdict. It says, we, the undersigned jurors, impaneled and sworn on the 21st day of April in the year 1857 in the township of Worth in the county of Woodford in the state of Illinois by Benjamin W. Kennedy, coroner, to inquire and true presentment make in what manner and by whom Roswell Goings, found suddenly deceased on the 18th of the present month, came to his death. After having examined the said body and heard the evidence, we do find that the deceased came to his death by violence, and that said body has on it the following marks and wounds inflicted by Melissa Goings, the wife of the deceased: a bruise on the back and a long deep cut on the head and the skull, much fractured and the brains injured, in which the jury did find did cause the death of said person in 5 days from the infliction. So it's pretty straightforward. The indictment gives a little bit more detailed version of what that head wound was, but the coroner's inquest does include that bruise on the back. And we will keep those injuries in mind as we read through these witness accounts. So the first account is going to be by Josephus Goings. So Josephus Goings was Melissa and Roswell's son. He lived nearby. He's listed right after on the census, so probably right next door to them. We know in 1850 he had lost his wife, and probably during the birth of their youngest daughter, Charlotte Ann. On the 1850 census, she's listed as being only 6 months old, and he is also raising 2 children by the last name of Watkins, which may be their sister Eliza's children. Her husband seems to have passed away prior to that, and so he was evidently raising those kids. So he will end up also factoring prominently in later on the case when we start looking at the trial too. So the testimony goes, Josephus Goings did not see the lick struck. She said she had struck him. I ran in and found him on the floor trying to get up. I assisted him into the rocking chair and washed off the blood. He appeared to have his mind until, and we're going to make out this word, about 12 or 1 o'clock. When it was entirely gone, I went for, it's probably Dr. Wood, who was a doctor there in Tazewell County. They lived right on that border there. I think the wound received shortened his days. He never spoke to me after he was hurt. He would answer by shaking, then nodding his head. The accident occurred on Tuesday. They had, in days previous, lived rather disagreeable. So any thoughts on that witness testimony?
You can nod your head, doesn't it?
He couldn't speak.
Just a second. She must not have been that injured. She's out
What was that?
Say it out loud.
What?
Oh, I just said she's not guilty. She can't be guilty. If he could nod his head, that didn't kill him.
Possibly. So Joseph, he says, didn't seem to do too much. Me personally, what I have noticed is he seems to have been with his dad for quite some time and answer his dad questions. I personally would love to know what he was asking his dad, because if he did ask Roswell about how it happened, did mom hit you, things like that, he clearly did not decide to share that with the jurors. It's also interesting to me that when Melissa struck him, she did not immediately go for Dr. Wood herself. She went to get her son, and then her son, rather than going straight to the doctor, waited. So any ideas of what anybody? We do not know the height of Roswell or Melissa. Well, we don't know. I know the statue across the square listed short, but we honestly don't know. We do know that, and that is worth noting, in the 1850 census, if you add 7 years to that, she would have been about 70, and he would have been about 77. Now, I did end up finding her 1860 census, where at that point she's only listed at 71, which would put her a little bit younger, but still late 60s to 70.
Had he been beating her for 50 years?
That is somewhat town gossip. There's nothing in the testimony that says how long it had been going on. I mean, Josephus seems to say in days previous.
People don't start beating people when
Yeah.
they're 76 years old.
Yeah, that's true too. And so, yeah, that is definitely.
A man who will beat a woman will keep doing it over
Yeah.
and over and over again.
Yeah, and that's true. But yeah, unfortunately, we do not know much about it. We will get into a little bit about the town gossip and some of the stories that were going on about Roswell after we read the court documents, but right now we are going to focus just on what the jurors of the court would have heard during the testimony and what they would have been able to make their judgments on. And then we also take a look at how those laws have changed into the 20th century to allow for self-defense cases. So if nobody else has anything else to say about Josephus, we can go on to the testimony of James Brady.
Are you saying that after she took off, they continued the trial?
No, they didn't continue the trial.
Then why do they have testimony?
The testimony, so what happened was during that coroner's inquest, when they exhumed Roswell's body, they took testimony at that point and wrote it down. So it's actually the coroner's inquest testimony that we're reading. Presumably it's the same testimony they would have given at the trial too, though. Because, and this is kind of different, most people would not expect this, but actually to be a witness at a trial back then, you actually had to pay a bond. So all of these witnesses actually had to pay $50 to testify, and just to ensure that they would not try to escape. A lot of them kind of doubled it up, just like if you were the defendant, you could get somebody else to help pay your bond. Different people were helping pay bonds, but yeah, they had to actually put down money and guarantee that they would not run away before the trial happened either. So that's kind of very different than what we expect today. But yeah, but if we get to James Brady's testimony, he said the old man stated about the window. He put his hand on her and told her hush. She dared him. He went over and she struck him. He told me about it's either it or a number of hours after it happened and said, I knew nothing more after she struck him. He said, I expect she has killed me. So that, I expect she has killed me. If you have ever seen the movie Lincoln, that they attribute to Roswell's will, but that is where that phrase came from. So any thoughts on this one? We have our first account of what might have happened that night.
The son had stated that he never spoke again.
Up until about noon or 1 o'clock, we don't know for sure. Yeah, that's the problem is we don't know. James Brady came later. There's some town gossips that say that some friends were able to revive him later on in the evening because he did live for 5 days. So it could have been any time within that 5-day period from Tuesday to Saturday. Anything else?
So James Brady is saying he admitted to him that he put his hands on her.
Yes, he admitted that he ran his hand about her, and then he seems to have, and told her hush. What exactly he means by put his hand on her is hard to tell, but either way, it's probably not good, to put it mildly. And then she dared him, and then it was after that he came over and she struck him on the head with the firewood. Anything else? If not, we can go on to Roswell Hibbs. So Roswell Hibbs is actually the grandson of Roswell and Melissa. In 1850, his mother, Nancy Hibbs, her husband had recently passed away, so she is living with her parents again. At some point, she had moved up to Iowa because by the 1856 census, that is where at least 3 of the kids were living. Benjamin, Edward, and Nancy were all up there, and possibly Eliza too. And so Roswell Hibbs then came, when he's talking about coming to see him, he's talking about coming back from Iowa, is what we presume. He said, "I was told the old man was hurt. I came to see him. He could not speak. James Brady came, and he said he would tell how it happened. He spoke about placing the board in the window. I took hold or run my hand about her neck, took my seat. She dared me to come there. I went, and she struck me. He said, if I get over it, I will have revenge." So there's that other portion in the Lincoln movie that we hear tribute to as well. If I get over it, I will have my revenge. Any thoughts about the actual crime at this point?
What do you think it means by placing the board in the window?
My guess would be is, I mean, it's April, maybe they're arguing about whether the window should be open or closed or put the board in the window. It seems to have been some sort of quarrel that they weren't happy about, but that's apparently what started the whole thing. And,
So he grabs her by the neck and she dares him to kiss him, basically.
Pretty much.
basically, he grabbed her by the neck, he sits down, she says, "I dare you," presumably to come back over here, and then it's at that point that she hits him with a stick of wood. The difference between self-defense,
And if I get over it, I will have revenge. He's
Yeah.
vowing revenge. So that,
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that sounds like this has been ongoing, like
Yeah.
it's battled back and forth.
yeah,
Because
that,
what we have done, they were married for 52 years at this point.
yeah, that's when they've been married and they.
So, that's a long time.
We need to. But yeah, so. With, I mean, obviously with gossip and everything, it is no secret that Roswell was not a good guy, that obviously this had probably been going for a long time. The problem is that just because somebody's a bad guy doesn't necessarily mean that's automatically a self-defense case. So what we were looking at here is
Somebody's
whether,
choking you, I think you can hit him.
but if you actually read his testimony, he doesn't say that he ever placed a hand on her again. He had sat down, she dared him, she hit him before he was even
He was just stroking
over
her
there.
neck.
What?
He was just stroking her neck.
Well, no, he did grab her neck originally, but then he sat down. At that point, the fight was over and Melissa could have walked
This
out.
was a very hard hit.
Yeah.
She used to splitting logs.
Yeah, it was a very, very hard hit.
Was she a small woman?
We honestly don't know that much. There
In
is,
fact, out there, she's pretty short.
yeah, but I think they just used a family member of one of the people that worked here as the model for that one. There's really no evidence. We do have a couple of pictures of like Benjamin and Edward and Josephus, and all of them seem to be a pretty sturdy build. So chances are that their mother probably would have been about the same too. Or the father, it's hard to tell which gene that came down from. But, so if we look at the testimony, yes, he was abusive, and yes, he had earlier grabbed her neck. But with self-defense, you have to be able to prove by both 18th and 19th and 20th century laws that you are in that account afraid for your own life, and that you did not really do anything to provoke the attack. So the question is, when Melissa decided she was going to kill him, did she decide after he sat down, this is it, I've had enough, and then she grabbed a log of firewood and he came over and she hit him on the head before he ever had a chance to grab her again? In which case that would be enough provocation to actually mean that that's murder. She decided she was going to kill him, she acted on that decision to try and get him to react, and then that's murder.
They could have got it off if there had been a trial.
It's hard to tell what would have happened in a trial. Lincoln, there's definitely also that other side of the case that if, she was just mad and said, oh, I dare you to come over. And then he got up, and then at that point, she's like, oh crap, I shouldn't have said that. And then grabbed a log of fire and hit him. Then that would be self-defense. The problem is that it's kind of hard to tell which way that would win. And that's kind of what this discussion is designed to be about, is what you guys think were the chances of either happening.
Sounds like a wife beater got way ahead of time.
Well, I mean, he definitely was no good, as one person put it. But the question is just more whether or not it constitutes self-defense or murder. But let's go ahead and we will head on to the last testimony here, which was Joshua Van Vilson. So I went ahead and put Van Vilson because that is what the court documents say. However, according to the U.S. Census and his Civil War records, his name is actually Joshua Van Vilson. And he would have been about 16 at the time of the trial, according to Civil War records. So it is unclear what kind of connection he had to Melissa and her family. In 1850 and 1860, he's listed as living in Peoria. In 1850, he's listed with the Ripple family. So whether it's that he was the only child of the Van Velsen and his mother got remarried, maybe both his parents died, or for whatever reason he was being raised by another family, that is where he was in 1850. In 1860 and 19, he is a farmhand for a family over in Peoria as well. So unfortunately, we don't really know why, how he was connected. He seems to have talked to Melissa at some time before and after it happened, and that is where his testimony seems to come from, but I will let you read it and see what you think about it. The testimony of Joshua Van Vilson is as follows. He states that Melissa Goings did strike the deceased, first on the back, and he fell, and second, between, and these are the two words that are up here, it's between something and something on the head, and he lay in a manner senseless on the floor for some time. The blows were made with a stick of stove wood about 1 foot long, a split stick about as large as his arm. He thought it was the cause of death. He lived not quite a week. He died on Saturday night. Lived 5 or 6 days. I don't know which. They had quarreled before then. I don't know how long he had been sick. About a month. Asked only once to eat while sick. Not hardly able to walk across the house while sick. If she ever struck him, she meant to kill him. If she could, she meant to kill him if she could. This was told to me 2 days before the fray by her. So any thoughts on this one? It's very, very different from James Brady's version. Any thoughts?
She was putting him out of his misery. He was sick for a month. What a nice person.
Well, that kind of explains though why, I mean, if the stick about 1 foot long and about as large as his arm, I mean.
And it was a split
Even
stick.
a large.
So to explain a split stick, that's when it would have had like a point to it and then a rounded edge. So if you had driven that pointed edge, I think, into somebody's skull, it would definitely cause quite a bit of damage rather than just what we're thinking of like a round log. And so that kind of makes more sense. And he does seem to have a little bit more detail in his about what that looks like.
I think they would have torn him apart in cross-examination.
You never know. I mean, it's hard to tell.
And you can't assume what the law looks like. Nobody can assume what the law looks like.
Well, this isn't, it seems like at some point,
We've all seen violent laws, and they never have sharp points.
well, the split stick logs, some of them, when they're split with an axe this way, they get a little bit pointed on the one edge. Okay, I set it up like that, but anyway, any other, yeah?
Could you say the witnesses had to spend $50 in order to give their testimony?
Yes,
And how would that equate to today in dollars?
I mean, $50, I know a horse cost about
It seems like a lot of
$200. Yeah. So that would have been a very considerable amount of money. Her bail was $1,000, so the bond or basically bail for the witnesses.
So if you didn't have $50 when you do something, you couldn't say anything.
I think they probably still had some ways they might have actually held you somehow in order, it's a bond, just like a bond for a prisoner, is my understanding. So it's to ensure that you do not leave the county, you do not leave the state, and you were there for the trial.
If you were in the
Yeah.
town, you came up to him and said, I owe something, but I don't have $50, and you couldn't say.
Well, you could say, but what they would do is they would hold you. These men were actually subpoenaed, and so they had to come and testify to court. The bond just allowed them to go free before court. And most of them seem to have been able to get together with other people, and some of them, like Samuel W. Bebb and Josephus Goings, both presented bond together, so each one of them only would have had to have had $25 in order to do that, so that they all made it. But yeah, it's kind of a crazy system. But anything else about the testimony of Joshua Grant Wilson? Any ideas of maybe what these two words are about here? I have not been able to make them make sense to anything that would be on a
This one is like comfort to me, to me.
Yeah, but it just doesn't make sense on the head, yeah.
Collapse? No.
And the second one definitely seems to be B, like an area.
What we're looking at is, all this people that are against her, that's all hearsay, basically. In today's courts.
In today's courts, it wouldn't be, but back then, we're first of all going to look at this based on 19th century laws, and then we'll also take a vote about her guilt and innocence based on 20th century laws, which, because we don't really have any other choice than to use these testimonies, these are what we're going to have to go on. But the law has changed when it comes to domestic violence, and so we will get into that after we take that first 19th century law. We want to kind of see what maybe the jury back then would have thought and felt, and what they maybe would have done based on what we would have done given the laws and that time period, and then also look at it from a modern viewpoint.
How were the jurors picked?
Basically, they just summoned a couple of men from the county off the voter list, just like we did today. What's interesting is that I think today you get in a lot of trouble if you actually don't respond to those, but back then, I looked through a couple of the terms, and there are people that do not show up in every single one of them, so seems to have been pretty common for people not to show up. So that's kind of interesting.
And if it had went to the jury, do they have to have a unanimous decision like we do today, or was it just a majority?
That one, I honestly have not been able to find anything conclusive that says one way or another. I would assume that just like today, it has to be unanimous. I know it was 12 jurors, just like today.
And they would all be men.
Then they would all be men. You had to be a free white male and landowning to serve on a jury back then. Although it is interesting, this particular term, the October term of 1857, one of the jurors that was called and did not show up, his name is listed, and then right afterwards in parentheses is listed color. So they do appear to have been summoning black men as well as white men when they were doing those jury selections. So that one, it's kind of interesting.
When they're doing the selection, they will be on the jury. They ask you about your history, like if you've been arrested and all that kind of
They
stuff.
seem to have done that because when you read the jury calls, they might summon, say, like 19 people, and maybe like 15 will show up. And then they will still go ahead and pull people from the audience, actually, the spectators that happen to be there to watch court today. So chances are, if they found a lot of people that were too close to the witness, then they could have, kind of found some other people. Although given the size of the county, it was probably around 3,000 at that time, maybe less. And so it would have been a huge, huge selection of people to choose from each time. So chances are people will serve multiple times.
I think just Joshua's testimony is the most incriminating.
Yeah, definitely by his account.
If you're saying someone was sick and only ate once in a couple weeks
Yeah,
and couldn't walk,
yeah.
it doesn't sound like self-defense to me.
No, by his testimony, and the one thing that gets me with his testimony is he is the only one that explains the bruise on the back of Roswell's,
With the back.
on the autopsy.
But
I'm
even,
so impressed, yeah.
whose testimony was it? Roswell's testimony, though, does say, that Roswell Goings, that's the husband, right?
Yeah, Roswell's
Yeah. It says, that he admitted to,
Yeah,
so he admitted to, daring her and then putting his hand on her.
well, he didn't dare her, she dared him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so,
It's kind of conflicting to what.
they're very conflicting testimonies, yeah. And that's a large part of the reason why I decided to go ahead and have this event, just because there's such a disparity between the different witness testimonies, that you really could go either way. And so I figured, it'd be something interesting. Most people have not actually seen the evidence that came out of this case. It has been largely based on town gossip. Well, we can discuss the actual history of the case. So, Melissa Goins' case actually did not gain really any notoriety, or it wasn't even written down until the 1950s. So what happens is, it seems to have been mainly just town stories, town legend, kind of the old timers would talk about it here and there. And when we discuss the Lincoln portion of it, we will get into the oldest recorded testimony of what those old timers were saying. But it was in 1840 that Charles Moore of Peoria was actually doing some research for the historical records, and then he discovered the Melissa Goins case at that point, and he learned Earnest East. So Earnest East is connected with the Illinois Historical Society. He has since passed away, but at one point he was president of that society. And then he really started digging into the case. We've learned a lot of stuff since he's written what he wrote, especially when it comes to the family members, thanks to modern surveys like Ancestry.com, which he just in 1950 did not have access to. And so he actually, in 1952, this is actually the first printed recording of the case, and that is based on Earnest East. And it talks about this new story that was unearthed in the Woodford County Courthouse. Actually, when I started my research here, that's kind of what interested me, because I had always assumed that that was always well known. But the way this book talks, it was something that people hadn't really heard of too much. And then in 1953, that is when he printed in the Illinois Historical Society's publication the very first and probably the most detailed version of Melissa Goins' case, and he's the first one to actually mention the witness testimony. A lot of the historians that you will read books about today, when they are citing sources, they are citing, to a certain extent, some of the court records, but a lot of them go back to East. And in 1963, John A. Duff wrote Lincoln Prairie Lord. And he seems to have interviewed East, and a lot of his account is from East work, and that is the main source that historians use when they're discussing this case. And so it's kind of interesting and important to look at, how this story evolved over time. And then we'll look at some of the primary sources that East used, like I said, a little later on. So did anybody else have anything to say about the Joshua Ben Wilson case before we maybe go to our first vote?
Relatives.
Oh yeah, we have, in this part here, these are all relatives, descendants of Melissa Goins and her family.
That's why I'm very careful what I say.
Yeah, no, I can fully understand.
My wife's fifth great grandmother and the girl's sixth great grandmother and Clayton's seventh great grandmother.
Yeah.
Walk softly and carry a big stick.
So you have you seen the pictures of the Edward and Benjamin and Josephus and maybe Armstrong on the ancestry? If not, afterwards I can definitely show you that. I can't use it in the presentation because that is copyrighted. So unfortunately I can't use that for this. Well, if we are ready to go to the vote, I will kind of explain to you the different options that the jury would have had back then and kind of what the what you would have had to have used as measurement. So the first option is murder. So the 19th century talks about malice aforethought. So that is what we would often call intent to kill. When Melissa struck him on the head, did she intend to kill him? Or at least cause harm to him that would have resulted reasonably in his death? The second option would be manslaughter. So manslaughter is that, you got into a fight, but you did not actually intend to kill the person. So it's a little bit less, yes, you did kill him, but it was not as planned, so to speak, as murder would be. And then in order to find her not guilty, obviously, in this case, the defense would be self-defense. So in order to be deemed for self-defense, it's very hard to research self-defense in the 19th century, and I'm not a lawyer, just to put that out there, so I'm doing the best I can to explain these. But self-defense goes by, in England it started out with more, you have the duty to retreat, it's called, which basically means that if you can walk away at a given time, you have to walk away again in a given time. However, America tended to kind of change that. We tend to kind of favor stand your ground laws, and that seemed to have started almost at the beginning of America's existence. Certainly by the end of the American Revolution, we were kind of switching to that concept. Now that, if you read about it, is mainly used for cases of somebody breaks into your home, you have the right to shoot them. It doesn't really give much guidance when it comes to self-defense. It could be argued, though, that if Melissa did in fact grab a stick of stove wood and told Roswell to come over here with the intent that as soon as he did that, she was going to kill him, that would not be self-defense, that would be considered murder because she is provoking him to coming over with the intent to kill him. If you believe that, she dared him to come over and she all of a sudden realized that that was not a good idea to actually dare the man that had just been abusing her to come over, and at that point grabbed the stick of firewood, then that could be considered self-defense. Obviously, Joshua Van Vilsen's testimony, if you believe his version of the account, that is pretty straightforward murder. If she said that if she struck him, she meant to kill him. And in fact, if she dealt the first blow and then the death blow was as he was on the floor, unable to get back up again. And so...
As a lawyer, I would be asking him, did she tell you that?
I know, and so that's why I really wish I could cross-examine these people half the time.
Yeah.
I'm reading through the accounts going, but what did they mean by this?
Yeah. Did she say that to you at some point in her life, that she intended to kill him at some point?
I mean, he says specifically if she ever struck him, she meant to kill him if she could. This was told to me 2 days before the affray by her. So the other question is what he means by the affray. Did he mean that 2 days before the murder, she said, basically, I'm done with this. If he does it again, I'm going to kill him. Or is he talking about the affray? He could mean maybe she told him before the coroner's inquest. Either way, at some point he is claiming that Melissa said, if I strike him, I'm going to kill him. And so
it sounds as though he'd been beating her for 52 years.
Yeah, unfortunately though, that, at that time period, was not a legal defense.
Well, women didn't get the right to vote for 60 years after.
Yeah, and, yeah, unfortunately, things were not quite as good for women back then, but that is why we are now looking at the 19th century case. There were no laws that would have allowed for testimony of previous abuse. So the only thing the witnesses would have heard was the testimony that you read here. Now, obviously, we do not know what those other witnesses would have testified to.
I don't think that's correct. I think they would have allowed that.
There's actually a lot of states now that it's not a legal requirement. Illinois is one of the few that actually allows it. And that's something
There's
that,
no testimony and they've been beating her for 50 years.
yeah, unfortunately, that is still true for many women in a lot of states today.
I don't think that's correct.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that one. But,
Well, I mean, that's not right. That isn't accurate. I don't know of any state in the United States that do not allow that testimony.
I didn't read which states did it, I just read that a few of them, it was an article by the International Council on Domestic Violence that was talking about how they want to help change it, because currently the US, the UK, and Australia are the only ones that have a law that actually says you have to allow this
We need to
defense.
talk about Illinois law.
That Illinois law, and we'll go to the 19th century first, but then we'll discuss exactly what that current Illinois law is, because Illinois has very specific laws about this right now.
I don't think the law on self-defense has changed in Illinois hardly at all since then.
It has a little bit, especially murder. Obviously, there are several different versions of murder now.
There always have been.
I mean, if you look at the indictments and stuff, there's no, Melissa Goins is indicted for murder. She's not indicted for first-degree murder, second-degree murder, felony murder, premeditated murder. There's about 6 different versions of the current works. But, all right, if nobody else has anything, we will go ahead and vote. And like I said, this will be on 19th century standards. Everybody's ready? Right, so the first one is murder, so we'll vote and show of hands, how many people think it was murder. Then by a show of hands, we will give how many people believe it was manslaughter. And then a second show of hands if you believe it was not guilty by reason of self-defense.
Okay.
Did you have a question over there? Or? I saw a hand raised. Okay. All right.
I have a question. I don't want her to know how I voted.
Well, we're all going to close our eyes so that way nobody can see.
Are we supposed to vote what we think, I mean, what they think?
No, based on what you thought, based on the 19th century
What the jury then
laws.
would have found. is what-
Yeah, based on just the evidence that you saw. And these, the jury would not have been influenced by all the like outside town gossip and stuff, and so we're trying to keep just to the court records today.
Okay.
And then, all right, everybody close their eyes.
So the jury would not, I'm
Okay.
sorry, the jury would not have come from people in
They would have been in Woodford County, yes.
the county, so they would have.
So they probably would have heard maybe some stories. They were
Okay.
hopefully trying to filter out anybody that actually knew the goings or knew of the goings like they do today. Although how successful. Obviously, if Lincoln felt that people were wildly against Melissa Goings and there was no way he could get a fair trial, he would have switched it to a different county. Oftentimes these cases, though, went to Tazewell, which, given how close they were to Tazewell, that may not have worked, but chances are Lincoln would have moved it if he thought he had to move it. All right, any other questions before we go? All righty. I'll go ahead and explain it to you. All right, let's go ahead and close our eyes then. All right, now by show of hands, who thinks it was murder? Okay. Can we just keep him up for a second? Okay. Okay, now by show of hands, who thinks it was manslaughter, we'll do manslaughter next.
Is what?
Manslaughter. Okay, now who all thinks it would have been not guilty, but by reason of self-defense? Alrighty, you guys can go ahead and open your eyes now. We have 7 for murder, 11 for manslaughter, and 5 for self-defense. So this clearly went manslaughter. That's kind of interesting because in preparation for this case, I actually read through all of the murder trials that are connected to Lincoln, whether he was helping the prosecuting attorney, whether he was the defense attorney, and only one of those actually were convicted of murder. Murder was a capital offense back then, and so I think for the most part they tend to kind of avoid it if they could. And most of them were manslaughter. The highest a person was ever, the highest sentence that anybody ever received was 8 years for manslaughter. Mostly it tended to be about 2 or 3 years, and so that seems like that's pretty fair for what maybe Melissa would have actually received had she gone there. The other interesting thing to note is, so I often tell people, this is not Lincoln's only murder case that he had here. He actually had 2. So the first murder case was that of Thompson. He was actually charged the year before Melissa. He shot a man in the neck and he died a few days later. So he was, during the trial, convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 8 years of hard labor down Alton Prison. Now, a year after Melissa Goins escaped, the people of Woodford County, including Judge Davis, who'd been judge on the case, actually got together and petitioned the governor, and he was released after having only served 2 years. So if Melissa had been tried, chances are, I honestly believe Lincoln probably would have worked together with lawyers to try and get the governor to try and get a pardon. There were certainly other means after a case before Melissa would have actually been out. And like I said, only one out of those, I think it was 10 cases that I looked at, actually resulted in murder. Most of them, manslaughter. So that's pretty actually probably accurate for the 19th century. Now for the 20th century, we all recognize that domestic abuse is something that we are more open to talking about than they were in the 19th century, and laws have somewhat changed in order to help victims of that. So Illinois actually requires that the defense be allowed to offer expert testimony on battered woman syndrome to be used. And so what some states call it, Illinois' specific term is it's a mitigating factor. So what that means is it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not guilty, but you can use it to lessen your sentence. So even if she was convicted of murder nowadays, that could be reduced to manslaughter, and it would be up to the judge how much time she actually is given. And judges are usually given pretty, I think, wide authority to decide what they think is fair when it comes to sentencing. And so some states, what they call that is called imperfect self-defense. So even in the case where a woman knowingly murders her husband, there's no fight, there's nothing. If she believes, because she has affective and battered woman syndrome, that is the only way that she can possibly escape what she has been through, that imperfect self-defense is allowed. Obviously, I do not know enough to give the expert testimony today, but I think most people here understand that Roswell Goings, by the witness testimony and by all town gossip, was most likely abusive, and according to town gossip, maybe a drunk too. So I am going to give you the same three options. Like I said before, there's a whole host of murder charges that you can do now, but we're going to simplify this and just say murder, manslaughter, and then I'm going to give you that extra option that you can decide murder, but then also give a mitigating factor to it as well. All right. Anybody have any questions?
So how many choices will there be?
So we'll have four
We'll have
choices.
four.
Original three plus the mitigating factor of an imperfect self-defense.
Okay.
If it was today,
Yeah. This,
just off of what's on here, or assuming
We are
other questions
also-
will be asked and
going to go ahead and just use the witness testimony just because we don't really have them here to question, so unfortunately we can't really, get all those answers that, I wish we could get from them. So it's based on witness testimony, same thing, same three defenses, then also, if you do decide on murder, you can switch that to a mitigating factor, using the battered woman syndrome.
Number 4 would be not guilty.
Huh?
With number 4, you're going to bring up.
Technically, you're still guilty, but a mitigating factor means that it lessens the sentence and the severity of the crime. So instead of getting whatever the charge for murder would be, you would get only that manslaughter charge, which is considerably less time served. Obviously, murder today can be murder, life without possibility of parole, on down.
I think we'll put number 5 in there, or 6, that she wasn't guilty.
Well, that'll be, murder, manslaughter, not guilty by reason of self-defense, and then murder with the mitigating factor of
Abuse.
abuse.
Does our vote say that we think that the guilty is going to be unanimous in murder or whatever, or just what we think?
You just have to base it on whatever you personally believe.
You're saying 12 jurors are going to say.
Yeah, in an actual murder case, obviously you guys would be narrowed down to 12, and you'd be stuck in a room for however many days or weeks to deliberate this until you decide. I'm not going to make you sit here for a couple of weeks, so we're going to do it in 5 minutes. But yeah, so it's just what you base it on. We're not going to be unanimous, obviously, but close enough. At least we get kind of an idea of where people stand. Alrighty, is everybody clear on the 4 options? Alrighty, go ahead and close your eyes again. Okay. Who votes for murder? Just the original murder. Okay. Alrighty, now who would vote for murder, but with the mitigating factor of domestic abuse? Okay. Okay, now who votes manslaughter? Okay, now who would vote for self-defense? And that's not reason, guilty by reason of self-defense. Alright. Everybody open your eyes now? Okay, for murder, we have nobody voted for murder this time around. For the murder with the mitigating factor of what matters women syndrome or domestic abuse, we had 7. For manslaughter, we had 8. And for not guilty by reason of self-defense, we had 9. So that one, not guilty by reason of self-defense, actually just barely won out of the other ones there. All right. Does anybody have any more questions about the murder? If not, we'll go on to the trial. Okay, now, this case is probably most well known, not for the murder, but for what happened after the murder. So, town gossip tends to place Lincoln as definitely helping Melissa to escape. But the question is, kind of where do those beliefs start? We will begin by actually reading the oldest account we have of what was going around in town gossip. So like I said, Earnest East in the 1940s is when he started researching this case. He actually wrote to William Bryan, who was the editor of the Metamora Herald, asking him for his account. He had let him know about an account he had found at the courthouse, which we'll read after this one. And so this is what East writes back. He writes not only the beliefs about what happened at the trial after she escaped, but also what the view of Roswell was. Yeah.
Did you have copies of those for us?
This one, unfortunately, I was just going to go ahead and read it. I just did the witness testimony, so we had something to look at while we deliberate. Dear Mr. East, I think your research has brought you far more information about the Goings case than is possible to obtain here. I have heard this tale told by old-timers here, long since gone, and it was substantially the same, differing only in the conjectures of what Lincoln told the woman that caused her to disappear. You've all heard the story, as I heard it, up to the point of the court's appointment of Lincoln to defend Mrs. Goings. Then, Mr. Lincoln asked the court's permission to consult with the client privately, which was granted, and with Mrs. Goings, he went to the lower floor of the courthouse. Court work went on, and after some time, it was noticed that Mr. Lincoln was back in the courtroom. The Goings case was then called. Not seeing the defendant, the court asked, Mr. Lincoln, where is your client? Lincoln responded, I don't know, Your Honor. I left her on the lower floor. She should be in the custody of the sheriff. The court ordered the sheriff to produce the prisoner, but after a search in which a number joined, the sheriff reported that the defendant could not be found. The story goes that the court was chagrined, but realized Lincoln was right. The sheriff was at fault. How the rest of the story was learned, deponent saith not, but there are several versions. Lincoln, after learning the facts as related by Mrs. Goings, told her she would be far safer many miles away, then left the room. The woman took the hint, climbed through an open window, and headed for a haystack a short distance north of the courthouse. Another tale was that Lincoln pointed to the haystack and said there was a team and wagon behind it, and that it was not his business to detain her. Take your choice. As to the crime, Goings was described as being quarrelsome and bibulous, and was during one of the quarrels the woman defended herself with a stick of stovewood, a blow on the head resulting in his death. In the words of one informant, he was no good. And so that is what, when historians and Mr. East talk about Mr. Goings' character, this is often the version that he is actually referencing. And then John A. Duff, that is also what he references as this letter. So that's the basis of Mr. Goings' character. And then as for the story of what happened with Mr. Lincoln, that is one version. I'll go ahead and read a second version real quick. So how this second version came about, this is what started East looking in the first place. In 1920s, one of the judges was retiring, and a lawyer who had practiced shortly after Lincoln did gave up, and he gave a speech kind of on the history of the courthouse and some of the lawyers that had practiced there, and he told a story that was told by Robert T. Castle. So it's important to notice, to know who Robert T. Castle was before we tell this story. He was a very prominent figure here in Woodford County. In the 1840s, he was a constable. By 1850, he was a justice of the peace. He is actually the justice of the peace, one of them during Melissa Goings' indictments. And it just so happens that he was serving as one of the constables during the trial. So this is this lawyer's version of what East told him. Castle remembered Lincoln quite well and told of Lincoln coming to court at Metamora when he rode the circle. Castle told the following Lincoln story. Mrs. Goings was indicted for the killing of her husband by striking him with a stick of stovewood. Lincoln was her counsel. Castle was acting as bailiff of the court, and and Mrs. Goings was brought into court that Lincoln might talk with her. After a while, Castle wanted her, and she could not be found. Castle asked Lincoln about her, and he said he did not know where she was. Castle replied, "Confound you, Abe, you have run her off." Lincoln replied, "Oh no, Bob, I didn't run her off. She just wanted to know where she could get a good drink of water, and I told her there was mighty good water in Tennessee." Mrs. Goings was aided to escape and was never tried, but Castle did not really charge Lincoln with being a party to the escape, but told it as one of old Abe's jokes. So, anytime this is actually referenced in histories, they tend to leave off that last line, which is probably one of the most important if you want to decide Lincoln's guilt or innocence when it comes to aiding a prisoner to escape. So does anybody have any thoughts? I think Dave?
Was she ever found, Melissa?
No, she was never found. So what we know for sure is in 1860, I recently found her on the census up in Iowa. She was living with her son Benjamin. Iowa does a state census, and so in 1856, 2 years beforehand, there were several siblings already living up there, and so best guess is she went straight to move in with the kids and just stayed there. And then eventually they moved out to California, and she died about 1865 out there. And so that is what happened to her. Now,
She just wasn't looked for. She was found, but she wasn't looked for.
yeah, we're not going to go and get a posse together and try to figure out, which state she was in this time. If you read back to, in the end of the William Ryan letter, I actually didn't read part of it, but Dr. East had asked him what happened to the family. He said that honestly, the people he talked to, they didn't actually know where any of the family had gone to. Armstrong Goings, who was the only son who remained in Illinois after the trial, was up in Eden, LaSalle County, Illinois. And so it seems like they did not tell that many people where they went, and certainly not the people who were going to tell the sheriffs. So this case, it's oftentimes quoted that, it was dismissed, and therefore that is an example of how they really didn't want to prosecute her. However, if you actually look at it, technically it was stricken from the docket with leave to reinstate. So what that means is they continued it to the next term after she escaped, and then it wasn't found. So then they had to continue it to the next term. So then that is the point at which they said, we probably are going to find her. And when something is stricken from the docket with leave to reinstatement, all that means is that they're not going to keep scheduling it until she happens to show up. Obviously, if they had kept going, it would still be on those court documents. So I think it had less to do with Phyllis's guilt or innocence and more about not going to do anything work any longer. Yeah.
Question about her name. When you find her on Find a Grave, it has Monica Melissa.
Yes.
Do you know anything about that?
So that is a very good question. Our best guess is that she probably went by both names. She is listed, there's Monica Goings that is married to a Roswell Goings, and I believe it's 1805 in Fredericktown, Maryland, which is where it says she's born. And that name is Monica Lett. So she seems to be going by that. In 1850, on that census, she is also listed as Monica. Now, there is a theory that Mr. East did look into that maybe he happened to remarry between 1850 and 1857. However, he was never able to find any of the marriage documents for Roswell Goings in Woodford County. The other thing that kind of proves that maybe that it was the same woman is that the same day that Melissa Goings escaped, her son Josephus was actually charged with attempting to bribe an officer of the court. So it turns out that back in April, during the indictment hearing before the Justice of the Peace, Josephus Goings offered that same Robert T. Castle $10 if he would just kind of not indict her. Obviously, he did not take her up on the bride. So that case ends up actually getting moved down to the Cass County Court. And in those court documents, it is referenced that he was helping his mother escape. So it seems to have definitely been the same woman that he was married to prior to 1850. So with Josephus, he jumped bail too. It's kind of interesting that if you look at Iowa land records, he actually purchased some land in August of 1857, a month before the trial. And then he purchased a little bit more land right after the trial. So he seems to have been planning on making that move before the trial ever came. Perhaps he knew that he was going to be in trouble for that bribing issue. There's a lot of versions that could take. It could also be that maybe they were not initially going to charge him until Melissa escaped. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, so maybe the kids had something to do with it. Which is, by that evidence, I think, it seems pretty clear that the court blamed the kids a little bit more than they did Lincoln. And it's important to discuss Lincoln at that time. So, by 1857, Lincoln was an accomplished lawyer. He would not have had to resort to telling a defendant to water is better in Tennessee. There were a lot of things that he probably could have done. He was very good about connecting with the jury. I think he probably would have been able to kind of play up the fact that Roswell was a horrible man and look at this poor woman, you know. And so I think he had a lot that he could have leaned on other than straight up trying to tell a prisoner to escape. It's also interesting that the question is why Melissa Goings too. He had a lot of other clients that were on trial for murder, and none of the other ones seem to have been told the same thing. But it is really interesting because he did tell that story. However, with a very different cast of characters. So in 1863, Lincoln was in the White House, and John Hay, who was his Secretary of State, they had gathered and they were trying to decide what to do with Union deserters. So Lincoln was looking around, trying to catch the eye of anyone who would maybe give sympathy to some of these prisoners, as he was known for doing. In the process, he told this story. And I will read Hay's account of the interaction here. He says, he told one good story about U.F. Linder getting a fellow off who had stolen a hog by advising him to go and get a drink, suggesting that the water was better in Tennessee. So clearly Lincoln had heard this story before. The only question is U.F. Linder, is if he heard the story from U.F. Linder, maybe Melissa Goings escaped, and he saw an opportunity to tell a really good joke. Lincoln obviously always the one to try and tell a good story, especially things probably would have been heated and in need of a little bit of humor after what had happened that day. The other option could also be that Castle heard U.F. Linder's story as well and simply attributed it to Lincoln in order to get a little bit of name recognition for himself too. As for whether or not Robert T. Castle was on duty that day, he was, in fact, yes. He was there. And that's the interesting thing about this case and her escape, is the court records list all the officers of the court that are on duty. And for all 6 days of the court, there were, make sure I get this right, there was the sheriff, there were 4 constables, 5 assistant constables, 2 deputy sheriffs, and a doorkeeper. That's 11 people that were all here on that day that Melissa escaped past. So you gotta ask yourself how that one happened. Yeah.
And the very first thing that you read, it gave a description of her. I think you said she was disagreeable and something.
Yeah, Josephus Goings. He says that in days previous they had lived rather disagreeable.
No, I mean, from, what you had just read, you didn't give us a copy of it, it was
Okay.
yeah, it says something about her being described as, in the courtroom, as disagreeable or,
I think that was for her husband, wasn't it?
no, it was just what you had first read, the court document.
I don't remember anything saying she was really disagreeable. In the first letter that I wrote, William Ryan, he says, as to the crime, Goins was described as being quarrelsome and bibulous. And it was during one of the quarrels that the woman defended herself with a stick of stone wood.
Okay.
So that is describing Roswell. And in case you don't know what bibulous is, I had to Google it personally. It basically is a drunk. So he had the tendency to drink and be quarrelsome.
Oh, I thought it said Melissa was described as being quarrelsome or something.
Yeah, he just says Goins, but I think it's describing Roswell.
Oh, okay,
So yeah.
okay. I thought that was while they were in the courtroom, she was,
No, there's nothing that's really given about her demeanor in the courtroom. Just that basically what happened was she came in, she pleaded not guilty, and then Lincoln seems to have talked to her at that point, and that's when she escaped. So really the trial had not even started. Now it is interesting though, in the court records, Brown and Herschel are actually listed as her defendants in one of the cases. This could be because on October 7th is when she was brought in for her recognizance hearing about whether or not she was going to be able to stay on bail, basically. And that is when those other lawyers were created. In Lincoln's day by day, October 6th, he was in Springfield. And this would not have actually been a normal circuit for him. 1857 is the year that we moved off the 8th Judicial and onto the 21st Judicial. So normally Lincoln would not have been on the circuit. He seems to have on October 9th had another case that he had been dealing with for a couple of years, and then he picked up a second case during that term. And so it is possible that maybe she had two lawyers that were there with her on the 8th, and then for whatever reason they decided that maybe Lincoln and Henry Groves, who was his co-counsel, would do a better job. Lincoln was very sought after by that point, so. Yeah.
Did you say there were 11?
There were 11 officers who were here.
And a 70-year-old who snuck out the back window and escaped?
Yeah, that's what seems to have happened. We don't know for sure how she escaped. That's one version. Although you never know, Josephus was willing to buy the justice of the peace. He was probably willing to buy a doorkeeper or a constable at some point too. And
She was an accused murderer.
yeah, she was. You never know. Maybe they thought that it's like there's no way this woman could get past us. It's hard to tell exactly how she would have managed to get out of this courtroom unseen. Anybody have any other comments on the trial?
yeah, either he had possibly bribed other people but they never admitted to it.
Yeah.
Or they just thought she's, 70 years old at that time was pretty.
Yeah, see,
Considerable.
for me personally, I think if I were trying to escape, I think I'd probably just say, oh, I need to go use the outhouse.
Right.
And then just not come back from it. But see, if Lincoln did leave her downstairs, maybe he came back upstairs thinking the sheriff was going to watch her. If the sheriff thought she was left Lincoln, there could have also been a little bit of confusion that happened that way as well. And so, actually women were in the courts quite a bit. Just like today, women are not oftentimes charged with murder. An interesting statistic that I read while I was researching this is actually about 70% of women that are behind bars for murder are behind bars for murdering a spouse who they claim was abusive.
No, back in that time.
I think what you're saying is the courthouse was full of men upstairs and downstairs, mostly except for this one 70-year-old woman.
Actually, Actually, not necessarily. Lincoln's other case that he had been dealing with for a few years was Lucy Ann Davenport versus Lucy Davenport, which was actually a dower case, where a woman was trying to claim her widow's dower rights. And so women actually are in the court quite a bit. They could sue if they're single. They could be there for divorce proceedings. They could be there. Dower rights are a pretty common thing.
This one particular trial,
This one particular,
there was one woman basically with a bunch of men and 11 officers.
for that particular case there was, we just don't know what other cases were on the docket that day, so there could have been other women, defendants, litigants, and witnesses that were milling around the courthouse. Plus, they didn't really have a lot to do back then, and the way the 8th Judicial Circuit worked at that time was they had several counties for one judge. And so lawyers would only come in for a few days a week, twice a year that is, and people liked to watch them. So basically it was their version of Judge Judy. And so people would pack a picnic lunch and they would go, sit on the courthouse square out there and just watch the lawyers talk. And so there would have been probably quite a few people going around, but that could have kind of led to...
They pointed and said, there she goes.
You would think somebody would have noticed it, but I don't know, I guess if you're caught up in whatever you're doing that day, I'm
Just
not
this
sure
woman
how...
climbing out the window of the corridor.
You would think they would notice screwing out the window, yeah. Especially because what I would like to note is that, so that way is north, right? The way we set it back then is we do know that they were fields in the north of the building in the back. And according to the town gossip is that she climbed through a window and headed out that way. However, if you look at the layout of the courthouse, the hallway is in the back. So there are no offices that actually face the north side of the building. So she would have had to have almost climbed out one of these side windows, in which case she would definitely think that it would have a nice clear view right from the square there. Which is why it's equally possible that town gossip just was having some fun. And she in fact maybe did just walk around the back door and somebody just wasn't paying attention.
Would there have been lots of people in the courtroom to watch? I mean,
according to some of the accounts, yeah, there would have been spectators that would have been watching the other proceedings. I believe it's the way Castle describes it, says that the first work, the other cases went ahead and they were still trying cases up here when Lincoln was downstairs talking, and then it was afterwards when Lincoln was back in the courtroom that they realized, oh, Melissa's not here though, and then asked him where she was.
Was the addition on the side of the courthouse?
No, those additions were not put on until the 1890s, so it's as the courthouse is today.
My understanding was that at that time the stairway was out front.
Yeah, so
This was not here.
during the trial, we have restored back to what it was. It was in 1870. What they were trying to do was move the county seat over to El Paso. Their argument was that the courthouse was just too small and they needed something larger. In order to keep it, that is the point at which they took out the stairs and put them on the outside front of the building, took out these two rooms in the back and actually made this one big courtroom just to basically allow a little bit more space, and they were able to keep the county seat for a little bit longer.
The other story that I've heard is that Lincoln took her out and walked around the square talking to her.
Okay.
There was a recess he asked for a recess for an hour because he had not met his client before. So he wanted to get the facts from her, and that they walked around the square, and then when he came back by himself.
Yeah, I had never heard that version. Yeah, that's definitely very, very different. On the same token, you would think that people would notice Lincoln coming back and he was missing a client. And then I believe Castle does mention that he was downstairs in a different room. I believe, let me see what he's, yeah, Castle remembers,
And that's why they did the statute. They just kind of assumed
That was,
that's what they did.
the William Bryan letter that mentions, that they were downstairs to the lower floor. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there are a lot of stories that have come through that case, and, it's always interesting because, yeah, I always hear, new things that come out too. So. And, it really could go so many different ways. Yeah.
Who did you say again was here, of the 11, like, law enforcement? Who was it all that was here?
Yes. There are two ways to look at this. There was definitely, the sheriff, Byron Meyer, was here, and he had 2 deputy sheriffs and a doorkeeper. Now, they then list 4 constables, of which 3 were here all 6 days. And then by Castle's name it says assistant, and then by the name of the guy underneath him it says constable. So that could either mean that Castle was acting as an assistant to the court, and then the following other names were also just constables, or all 4 men could have been constables. But it would have been a sheriff, 4 to 8 constables, Castle, and 2 deputy sheriffs and doorkeeper.
The reason I was asking, have you ever read or heard, we knew Gene, the curator,
Yeah.
that was here before real well, and he told us a story that after they found out that she had disappeared, that it would have been like the duty of the sheriff to swear out like a warrant for her arrest.
They did issue a warrant for her arrest. They had already issued, so there's an Elias Capias, which is basically a general warrant for an arrest, it sounds like. And that was actually issued on October 8th. Murder was not usually a bailable offense, so that may be why some historians think that she was actually remanded into custody. But then when she escaped, it's, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it, but it's Fascius, I believe. And what that is it is a warrant that you have to come in and prove why a sentence should not be carried out against you, is the way it's put in the legal books. But so yes, there was definitely a warrant issued pretty quickly for her arrest.
After she escaped?
That was after she escaped, yes, a warrant was put out really quick.
So Gene always told the story that they didn't go look for her, and he thought his assumption was because the sheriff was due for re-election, and the consensus and the vibe around town was that he got what he had coming, so he knew it wouldn't be very popular for re-election.
Yeah, and that's definitely, I've heard that a lot of people say that there wasn't really much effort to pursue her. However, I have read about other people who have escaped about that same time period. Because of the way Illinois is, it is very, very, very difficult to find people. So we were mainly prairies back then, and while most people kind of think of a little house on the prairie with, like, the little sweeping grass, actual prairie grass was up to 8 to 10 feet tall, and it could conceal a horse and rider. And so if that was at its height, there's really no finding people if they want to stay hidden. And so even if there were attempts, plus if she already had planned out where she was going in Iowa, it would not probably have taken much to just plan it out. Plus she had at least one child who was, trying that way. And so all it takes is a couple other kids kind of helping to act like her own little underground railroad, so to speak.
And I assume states didn't share that kind of information because she's on the census in 3 years later in Iowa. So they knew, somebody knew.
Yeah, but you gotta think though, what are the chances that somebody in Woodford County is going to be reading through the 1850 census for Iowa? So it's like pretty safe about the digital age. And I know there's been some arguments even today that a lot of county, states don't really play well with each other. Yeah.
So you mentioned Gene.
Mhm.
I was under the understanding he was writing a book about other court cases that Lincoln had. Did he ever complete that?
I have never seen anything about that. I know he has his version of the Melissa Goings case.
Yeah, I know he had that, but he was going to the courthouse and reading other court cases.
I have not seen any records of that here. He left a lot on our computer, and I know there's some other cases. He has a lot of research that he has done on, like, Woodford County history. He's done a lot of research on Illinois Lincoln slave cases, I know, but I haven't seen any county cases.
Did he write any in complete book form?
No, none of them are like completely written down, and most of them are fairly short, and I don't remember any other Lincoln cases being mentioned by him. The closest thing is I know he went through the county commissioner's report for the history of like when the courthouse was built, but that's probably the most thorough county records he has. But yeah.
I was just told that he was,
And it could be, it may be on my personal computer that he had at home too, if he didn't do it here. But unfortunately, no, I haven't seen anything like that.
Does Roswell Billings have a criminal history at all, or is there any log of him?
We don't know. There is no criminal history that I have ever seen on him.
No, but we know Melissa had, right?
I just wondered if maybe that was why the sheriff maybe didn't see her going out the door, because they were sick of him too.
Yeah, you never know. You have a whole list of suspects there who might have taken a bribe and kind of went another way.
Seems to me if it would have went either way, he kills her or she kills him,
Yeah.
it seems like the
Long history.
consensus was that nobody would have been surprised.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's,
It wasn't a healthy relationship, maybe just one of convenience or whatever.
yeah. Yeah, although I will say it does seem like she has a very good relationship with her kids. They always seem to, everybody moved up to Iowa at the same time, everybody moved out to California about the same time, so they kind of stayed close together, other than Armstrong, but he had already been married, actually probably know, and was pretty established there in LaSalle County. So he would have had quite a bit more incentive, I think, to stay.
Sure.
What did you say?
Well, if we are done with discussion, I would like to thank you all for coming out, and make sure to keep an eye on our Facebook page for